Okay, just a quick note on the front end. If you haven't heard already, we're running a little Kickstarter campaign on trying to get us a new microphone and mic pre. So if you could help out, just check the show notes or check Kickstarter.com and do the normal searches, you'll find us. But with that, I bring you Rob Hordijk. Okay, today I have the great pleasure of getting a chance to talk to somebody who's really intriguing to me. His name's Rob Hordijk, and he is a synth designer that has a very sneaky, strong reputation in the synth community. He's been involved in stuff that's a little DIY oriented, but he also develops synths for sale. And everybody, when I talk to people that have his synths, they talk about them as being like desert island synths, the kind of things that they could spend their life on. And so whenever I hear that, I get really excited about talking to the designer, and so that's what I get to do today. So I'll stop talking and let's talk to Rob himself. Hey Rob, how are you?
Hi, I'm fine. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to talk to me. I really appreciate it. Let's start off by having you talk a little bit about what your work looks like right now. What kind of things are you doing?
Well, basically, I'm building modular synthesizers. There's a long waiting list, so I have a lot of work for the future, building all that are in order.
Yeah. How long is, just for argument's sake, about how long is the waiting list in terms of years?
Well, it's like 1.5 years or something.
Wow. That's something else. I'll tell you, congratulations on the work that you do because, like I said, everybody that has yours set up just treats it like it's their most prized possession. A lot of them talk about it almost like it's their child, right? It's pretty fun.
Yeah, well, thank you for the compliments.
Yeah, now one of the kind of tenets of your design is a circuit that is really unique that you named the Rungler, right?
Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit what that is?
Well, first, it's maybe better to say that basically I design electronic music instruments, and there are several parts that make up an instrument, and one of them is the Rungler, but there are many other parts that are necessary to make it into a complete instrument. So myself, I like to look at it as basically I developed a design method, and this design method basically starts with a concept. And in this concept, you think of things like economic issues, specific mechanical, technical kind of issues, but also, of course, the purpose what the instrument will be for. And so basically from this conceptual design comes like a functional design that gives a list of all the functions that would fit that particular concept. Then in the next stage, you find the proper algorithms for these functions, and then you implement these functions in hardware or software or whatever fits the concept. And then eventually there is a synthesizer, a new synthesizer.
Uh-huh. Right. That's a very thoughtful way of going through it. And it does point to something that is really clear, which is that despite the fact that a modular synthesizer can be kind of pieces that are combined at people's whim, it does seem that you put effort into designing a system rather than just individual modules. Would you say that's true?
That is totally correct, and that is also because I believe in musical instruments.
Hmm.
So when I started with the modular synthesizers, building them some 10, 12 years ago, then I was thinking who at this moment would actually want to use a modular synthesizer. I didn't really think that keyboard players would be interested because having to repatch a synthesizer on stage is not a very convenient situation.
Right.
Yeah, so basically more I was thinking that people that want to do sequencing and are into the more abstract kind of electronic music would be interested in modular synthesis. But For me, a modular synthesizer is not really about modules, but it is basically about modulations, because the one thing that makes a modular synthesizer different from other types of synthesizers, like keyboard synthesizers, monophonic or polyphonic or whatever, is that with a modular synthesizer, you basically can modulate everything with everything.
Right.
And that is the one most important feature of a modular synthesizer. And in that sense, I think that modulations are more important than modules.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so, because the question is also what exactly is a module? It is very hard to define a module. You can say, well, a module does only one very simple musical function, like it generates a pitch or it controls the amplitude. But these days, if you look at all the modules that are out there, especially in the Eurorack world, then you see that these modules are more like little systems themselves often.
Right.
So the whole original idea of modules, I don't think is the good starting point. I think that the better starting point is the idea of being able to modulate everything with everything.
Right. Well, and it's interesting because, I hadn't thought about it that way before, but you are right, which is that especially in the Eurorack world, what you see is people get really excited by the module rather than the interaction of modules. And so that's why you get some of these modules that tend to be, it may as well be a Roland keyboard just behind a modular panel because there's very few patch points and a whole lot of menus. So, one of the things I'm curious about is the development of some of the things beyond modules. So, one one of the instruments that you designed that really tickled me was a thing called a Blippu box. Is that
Yep.
is that the right name, right pronunciation for it?
Yeah, that's fine. Blippobox, yes.
Yeah, what that is fascinating because I've always felt like a small self-contained unit can be fun because it's easily portable and there's something cute about it. But so often they have very conservative routings and modulations. That seems to be the opposite case in the Blippu box, right? Which it seems like it's all oriented around modulation and more than almost any other function.
Yeah, well, there is basically a very long history before this Blipper box of ideas. And first of all, I like to build what I call myself a patch in a box, which is
Okay.
basically a very simple kind of structure, but that structure produces something that does not necessarily sound like a monophonic keyboard synthesizer, or doesn't even have to be based on things like melody, harmony, rhythm, etc., etc. But it's more like a sort of a box that produces a sort of an abstract soundscape and has sort of a life of its own, but you can influence it. And that's just a fun thing to do. It's a little pleasure of mine to build these kind of boxes.
That's really interesting. Now, one of the things I would say is that for all the people I've seen or interacted with that use your systems and your whether it's modules or other devices, I'm not sure that I ever saw anyone ever hook up a keyboard to it. It seems like maybe even more so than Buchla, you've sort of like gone a completely different way. Now, you said that when you started your designs, you figured this wouldn't be something that would be of interest to keyboardists, but somehow your design like draws people into just controlling it via its own knobs. How did you make the design choice that would drive people in that direction?
Well, for these sort of patch in a box kind of things, they are not really designed for musicians. Actually, I call them what the French call objet d'art.
Uh huh.
Basically, it is a little object all by itself, and I like it to have a sort of a mysterious kind of thing. It does things, but it is a bit unclear what it does. But you can sort of make it do different things, and it should be able to do many things, and it's not specifically with musicians in mind. And for instance, when I designed this Blipper box, I first made four, and I had no idea what to do with them. I showed them to a couple of friends, and they said, "Oh, I like it. Can I have one? Maybe you build some more." And so that's basically the way how these things start. But I have a lot of friends that are in sort of like this improv scene and noise scene, etc., etc.
Right.
And they seem to do very interesting things with them. I think I built like 160 of these Blipper boxes.
Really?
I was at an event a couple of weeks ago where there were 3 people performing within their performance set up a Blipper box.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, that was quite fun. But I remember when I first built them, I think some 10 years ago or something, the first, I just took a couple to, I was visiting some friends in the Bay Area, and I took a couple with me, and I left some there with people. And but these were basically more people like in the improv jazz scene, and they liked them very much. And so I asked, so what is it about this Blippo box? Why do you like it? And they said, well, basically we like to play with electronics, but we don't want these devices that have menus that you have to wade through and things like that. And this box is very simple. There is 12 knobs. There's nothing else, just an output, and you just dial up some sound, and it can do a lot of different types of sounds. So you just dial up a sound, and it starts producing all these little blips and clicks and blah, 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 blah. And then you take your instrument, maybe a saxophone or a trumpet or whatever, and you improvise along with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, that is a very valid way of using a Blipper box. Yeah, but when I build these boxes, I don't really have those kind of things in mind. The modular system that I built, which is basically my main work, because these blips are more like little extras, those are specifically designed with specific musical purposes.
Right. One of the things that's kind of a tenet, though, of your work is that you sort of embrace chaos in at least some of your generating functions, right? That seems to be a really important part of your system design. Would you say that that's true?
Yeah, and that is because if you want to give behavior to a box, if you make a box or a function that has its own kind of behavior, well, I got interested in chaos theory way back in the 80s of the last century and studied it. And in those days, it was more about graphic functions and little pictures. But I was curious about how to apply them to music. I remember I tried these sort of chaos functions with sound, but mostly that was a bit disappointing until I found a couple of tricks that actually sort of work out musically and can give a piece of electronics sort of like a behavior of itself, like a bit like it's alive.
Mm-hmm.
And chaos theory is basically the best way that I have found to go about. So chaos is different from randomness, because randomness is just totally random, but chaos basically means that it is a system with a certain complexity. But this complexity is basically too complex for the human mind to sort of grasp. But with a bit of luck, it behaves like things in nature behave, because we find this chaos theory back in nature in basically in everything.
Well, I think it's a good thing to point out the difference between chaos and random, because I think a lot of people just assume, well, if I need chaotic behavior, I can just sample and hold a noise thing and there's my chaos. And in fact, one of the sort of kind of like easy definitions I one time heard of in terms of chaos is that it's a function where the pattern that's created is too complex for our brains to see as a pattern, right? Because our brains kind of work like pattern recognition devices, but once a thing gets too difficult, it's hard for us to track it in that way, you know.
A chaotic system, it's a bit like a servo system, but a servo system has one state that it always wants to go to. But a chaotic system basically has several of these states. sometimes an unlimited amount of states. And so the trick of a chaotic system is that it sort of, if you just get it a bit out of balance, it has a short time of almost random behavior, and then it gets stuck in a pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And that is basically a balanced state. It's what they call a strange attractor.
Mm-hmm.
Then when you sort of disturb this balance, it will move to another balanced state. And the way that these balanced states can be used musically is when they sort of create little patterns. And if these patterns are relatively short, like between 4 or to 40 steps or something, so short enough for us to recognize as a repeating pattern, then it's very useful musically.
Right.
And these new patterns, don't have to have the same length. Very often they double in length or they halve in length, and the thing that they call bifurcations. And then if you can make a system that now and then disturbs itself, it becomes like a system that can do something for maybe 1 hour, the same thing, but then suddenly after an hour, it completely changes its behavior.
It's almost like it gets tired of doing that and does something else, right?
Yeah, and that's just incredible fun to play with.
Oh, indeed. Well, the other thing is then too, when you're working with these chaotic systems, very small changes in control settings will have really extraordinary changes in the result, right?
Yep, that's possible. Yep.
So the question is then how do you decide the balance between something that's chaotic enough to be interesting, but still kind of controllable enough to be musical in some way, an instrument?
Well, the trick that I find out myself that works well is if you make a sort of a what I call a balanced system. That is when you have. So, for instance, there's another project I did which is called the Benjolin,
Hmm.
which is a typical example of such a system. It has 4 components, basically 2 oscillators and a filter, the third component, and then the fourth component is some sort of function that creates an interference between the 2 oscillators. And this interference is basically a pattern, a control voltage pattern.
Okay.
And what you then do is you feed back this control voltage pattern into the pitches of the oscillators and into the cutoff of the filter. And there you are.
I see. Right. So then it's almost like watching the output and then tweaking the input to keep things sort of under control.
Yeah, and then basically this fourth function that creates some interference between 2 sources,
Hmm.
that is where you can vary enormously. I very much like to use a circuit that's based on what they call a shift register, because it's a very simple and cheap circuit that basically is controlled by 2 sources and can basically produce a stepped control voltage on its output when you take several of the outputs to connect them to a digital to analog converter. You have to sort of minimize the number of steps and the number of control voltage levels. If you keep the control voltage levels to maybe like 5 to 8 levels,
Hmm.
then it tends to sort of automatically get into interesting pattern kind of stuff. If you would make a digital to analog converter that would produce maybe 256 levels or 65,000 levels, then it doesn't really work that way anymore. So it is sort of like you have to find the right balance between complexity and simplicity.
Right. Your thoughtfulness behind the development of these instruments is really interesting and really inspiring. Can you tell me a little bit about your background? What is both your musical and your technical background that got you to the point where you can speak so eloquently about both sides of that equation?
I'm basically trained as a designer and not a musician. My background, but that goes way back till the 70s of the last century, is basically in art. But in those days, I was quite interested in the idea of sound as a material to be sculpted in the same way that you can sculpt wood and metal. And I was sort of thinking like, why, sound is interesting if you don't look at it from a musical point of view, but more because sound is always around us and there's many, many, many sounds. Of course, I'm not the first to think these things because many composers have been thinking about this in the last century. And then you can basically go two ways. You can make like mechanical objects that makes all sorts of sounds, or you can make electronic objects that makes all sorts of sounds. But what I like about the electronic objects is that you don't see what makes the sound, which you do with the mechanical object.
Right, of course.
It opens a way to sort of make it a bit mysterious how the sounds come about. Yeah, I remember like in the 70s, in the late 70s, I was very much inspired, for instance, by the work of Brian Eno that was releasing those ambient records, basically being sort of the first to do that, and also sort of making that kind of abstract electronic music popular amongst young people in those days that were mostly into rock and roll and that kind of thing.
Right.
And so I've been looking more like to electronic music, like a bit like how you would look at abstract painting.
Yeah.
So more a sort of combination with art, because I've always wondered why art and music are quite separate worlds.
It's funny that you say that because I used to work at a university and I was actually like a sound arts professor in the art department. But they literally had in the university, the art department was on one side of the university and the music department was completely on the other side of the university. It was like they wanted to keep them apart, like, something bad might happen if we got these people together.
Of course, there have been attempts of sort of putting those worlds together, like the futurists from Italy in the beginning of the 20th century, Luigi Russolo and the Intonaro Mori and things like that, where basically music and art were sort of tried to put together. And there have been many other attempts, but somehow the music world and the art world sort of, like to be separated. Yeah, but I don't know why that is.
I don't either, quite frankly. So I'm curious then, if with your background in art, how did you get to be comfortable enough with electronics to be building your own gear?
Well, I was interested in electronics from a very early age on. Basically, I remember I was born in '58, so in the '60s we still had these radios with tubes, and as a kid I was totally fascinated by these radios. I always wanted to look in the back when it was on and see the tubes glow, and I wanted to know how it worked. And so I already started to play with electronics, 12 years old or something. Something very good happened to me because my father noticed that I was interested in electronics. And I think when I was like 14 years, he gave me this subscription course in electronics that would lead to this examination for getting a license to operate a ham radio.
Oh, okay.
So when I was 15, I actually did the examination and succeeded. And so already at that age, I knew what tubes did, I knew what transistors did, I knew about waves and modulation systems and things like that. The things that you would learn to get that ham radio operator license.
Mm-hmm.
So then around 1980, you got all these synthesizer chips. Like the Curtis chips that were freely available on the electronics shop at the corner, and little microcontrollers and processors. And I was just more as a personal interest, not really having the idea to make it into a profession, but just as an interest. And I learned about that stuff in those days.
Mm-hmm.
And later in the 80s, I also, after having finished art school, I actually did 11 years of study in information technology. So basically, I became a system designer,
Ah,
system
okay.
analyst, system designer, and learned about methods and how to design stuff and how to make inventories of what you want and God knows what, everything that you need to build an information system, but that applies also to synthesizers. So it's sort of like a mixture of I know about art, I know about systems, I know about electronics. Yeah, and then the only thing that you can do is design synthesizers.
Yeah, if that's your three-cornered career, I guess that does put you into synthesizer design, doesn't it? Let's talk a little bit about the systems that you do build. So you, first of all, one of the things I think that would surprise many people if they heard what the work was first, I think they would often be surprised if they'd see it and see that it looks almost like an old style Moog system, even though from a sound standpoint it sounds like it should be more of a West Coast. I almost hate to talk about it in those terms, but I will. It seems like it should, be more Buchla like. What is it about the design that drew you towards that 5U kind of look and sizing and all that stuff? What drew you into that?
Well, I can comment a bit on this East Coast West Coast thing because very often I get the question: Is your system East Coast or
Right,
West
yeah.
Coast? And then I say, well, it's Dutch West Coast. That's what it is. Has nothing to do with American East Coast or West Coast. It's Dutch West Coast. Basically, you start with a concept, and in this concept, ergonomic aspects are important. And now, my first synthesizer was an AMS Putney a long time ago.
Hmm.
These AMS Putneys, they have one really nice thing about them. That is that if you sit before an AMS Putney, it is very comfortable to play. You have a lot of space between the knobs. You have these little pins. It's you have a very good overview of what is happening. The idea that a system also needs to be comfortable to play is, in my opinion, very important.
Right.
I remember I bought a Dupfer system, I think around the year 1990, one of these A100 systems. Although actually I liked the sound very much, that was not a problem. But economically, it was a disaster.
Right.
I always said that my fingers were too thick for the system because you have to sort of get your fingers in between lots and lots of cables to relatively very small knobs. And I must say that those systems from those days, from Dupfer, the connectors weren't really very reliable. So it was basically hell to play. It was very uncomfortable. I thought, now, if you compare that to like a Sinti or a Putney, then in comfort that is such an enormous difference.
Right.
So comfort is important, and that's the ergonomic aspects of the design. So at a certain point, you can come up with a sort of a form factor yourself that is based on comfort. But I felt like, well, it's not a bad idea maybe to make it look like a sort of a traditional modular synthesizer. And why not use these panel sizes that Moog and .com and MOTM, etc., were using, so that basically maybe it's possible to combine with modules from other brands, etc., etc.
Right.
The comfort of playing is, in my opinion, much better with somewhat larger systems.
Well, and in your case, not only is it that they're larger and you have more room around the knobs, but also you made the decision to bring all the connectors to the bottom of the module so that they don't interfere with you controlling. And it really makes sense when you consider that so much of working with one of your systems is controlling it through the knobs rather than through a keyboard or a MIDI interface, right?
Yeah, but that is because I designed a system where basically you can modulate everything with everything. All the signal levels are optimized to work with each other. It doesn't matter if you modulate at a very slow LFO rate or at audio rate, or move an oscillator pitch from an LFO range to an audio range. That means that these connectors, well, basically, I had this idea of making sort of like modules, but these days I actually call them sections,
Hmm.
because maybe that's a better name. Maybe one day we should get rid of this word module. But but for now, we still talk modular synthesizers. But for myself, I sort of call it sections. So I had this idea of sort of grouping 8 knobs with 10 connectors, because that is quite easy to build. Basically, the mechanical way to build them is that there is a PCB with 8 pots, and behind that PCB is a PCB with all the active components that do all the functions. And these are connected with flat cables, and then flat cables go to PCBs with connectors that are mounted under these PCBs. And that way it's relatively easy to assemble. I need certain parts to sort of mechanical parts to hold everything together, but
Hmm.
I can make them the same for every section, and that way it's more easy to build.
Yeah, but now you've also kind of like set yourself up to say that whatever algorithm that you do has like 8 knobs and a certain number of jacks. Do you ever find that that limits you from doing what you want to do with one of the modules, or is it the kind of constraint that helps focus you?
It is often a good idea if you design something to impose a certain limitation upon yourself.
Hmm.
Basically, the way how I design is that first I go wild and I go complex until I feel that I've hit some good stuff, and then I simplify. And this process of simplification, that is actually quite important, because maybe I have a design that could have like 14 knobs and 18 connectors, and then by sort of simplifying it back to 8 knobs and 10 connectors with the most important functions, that actually tends to add strength to the design.
Okay.
Yeah, so basically every knob is sort of equally important,
Hmm.
while the extra knobs that I skipped were probably the less important knobs that maybe do just a little but not much.
Hmm. Do you ever have find yourself like finding the ways to make a single knob do the work that originally 3 knobs were doing, like by collapsing the function into one turn?
Well, for instance, well, there are, of course, many sort of tricks to simplify things. And one of the things, for instance, is if you make a mixer, if you need to mix 2 signals, then you can make a 2 knob mixer with a knob, level knob for each signal. But you can also make a crossfader that works with 1 knob,
Hmm.
which is simpler. But going that direction actually gives you a new perspective, because then if you have 1 knob, then it's probably also easier to modulate that 1 knob with 1 CV,
Hmm.
the modulatable mixer.
That's a really great example because, I mean, also the other thing that happens is when you bring in the function of a crossfader, there's this implied function that if you're bringing one thing forward, the other thing is going to the back, right? And that is it's a design choice that you're helping to establish by putting together this kind of interaction with it. Now, when you're developing the algorithms themselves, do you intellectualize them first and then make circuitry? Or do you get really large ideas, put together some circuitry, and then see what happens? How much of it is chaotic for you?
Well, actually, thinking in terms of algorithms is on a sort of an abstract layer all
Hmm.
by itself,
Hmm.
because an algorithm, it's a bit like a recipe for a meal. An algorithm is just a description of an efficient way to do something. And the choice how to implement that algorithm comes after the algorithm is fully worked out. Because then you may think that, oh, maybe it's better to use analog electronics or digital electronics or maybe even mechanical solutions. But algorithms is well, if you work with sound, then you work with waves and waveforms and wave phenomena. And so there is a lot of mathematics about how to deal with waves and stuff like that. So basically, the algorithms are mathematic. And I'm not a mathematician, but I know enough of the mathematics behind all these wave phenomena to be able to sort of figure out algorithms.
Mm-hmm.
So last night I had a conversation with someone about filters. Many people don't realize it, but what you actually do with to get a filter function is first what you start to do is to create phase shifts and phase shift your signal, and then basically by combination of the phase shifted signal with the original signal, you get cancellations of frequencies in certain bands, and that basically gives you the filter function.
Mm-hmm.
So to create a filter is not like take a couple of components and glue them together and that's a filter. Now, basically, there is an algorithm behind it, and that algorithm is based on solid mathematical stuff.
Principles, yeah.
But luckily, the mathematics are not really that complex. It's all basically Newtonian mathematics figured out 300-400 years ago. So it's not quantum mechanics, luckily.
Right, yeah. I hear you. So, Rob, our time is just about up, but before we go, I would like to talk a little bit about you mentioned before a little bit about the Benjolin. Now that is actually I think it's like about the only design that's commercially of yours that's commercially available in Eurorack. Is that correct?
Yeah, basically the Benjolin is a do-it-yourself. It's my gift to the do-it-yourself community.
Okay.
So there is schematics and PCB layouts just freely available on the internet, and originally it started as a workshop. I remember visiting one of these circuit band festivals and having a couple of interesting conversations with people about electronic kits, and that there are many electronic kits sold, but most end up unbuilt on a shelf somewhere in the cupboard.
Right.
Then I had this idea, well, maybe it is an interesting idea to offer a workshop where people actually in a controlled environment build a do-it-yourself project and for the first time and do some soldering and stuff, and then if they have done it successfully in the workshop, then maybe later when they go home and see these kits that they bought, so you think like, maybe I should solder them together. And yeah, so
So you were trying to kickstart them into getting their work done, right?
yeah, and the word Benjolin comes from it. It was the device itself is sort of bent by design,
Mm-hmm.
so you don't have to circuit bend it. It's already by design circumbent, and it's a bit in between a banjo and a violin.
Well, that's a perfect place to land. It's great.
Yeah. And so first I started to organize workshops. I did a couple in the United States at Harvest Works in New York and some upstate New York somewhere and in Europe. And that sort of got it going. I think that some 400 people built Benjolins workshops. And by sort of guaranteeing that at the end of the workshop they would go home with a working device,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that at the end of the workshop I had to do a lot of checking, but I fixed them all, so people really went home with a working device.
Mm-hmm.
And then about at a certain moment I didn't have time anymore to do these workshops, but I already put it in the public domain straight away. But then, of course, there are people that cannot build these kits for some reason, or because they don't have the time, or they really don't know, they have left hands or something.
Right, right.
I had a couple of requests from people to do it as a module. So I licensed the idea to Epoch Modular, that is making a Benjolin for Eurorack. to a guy named Derek Holzer from Berlin, who is also known under the name Macumbista, who basically builds them as standalone boxes with banana connectors. There is PCBs available through several fora like Muffwiggler. It's only that I would like that people basically would try to build it themselves. And there's quite a few, I get a lot of emails from people that actually etched their own PCB and drilled it and made it and successfully built it. It's just to stimulate a bit the do-it-yourself world.
That's really interesting. Well, and you and I are roughly the same age. You talked a little bit about coming up, and it was like the ham radio movement kind of got you into electronics. It seems like these musical devices are kind of an entry path now for the current generation of folks to get into electronics. And so, if that's by doing what you did there, you actually helped them move that forward. That's really fantastic.
Yeah, I hope I have been able to contribute my 2 cents to this community.
This conversation, yeah. So before I let you go, I know if you're already a year and a half behind on getting systems built, you're probably not worried a lot about churning a lot of new stuff. But you're a designer at heart, so you must have designs that you're playing with. What kind of things are you working on for the future?
I have notebooks full of stuff and ideas and things that I breadboarded, and basically hundreds of them. But actually, to come from an idea that works on a breadboard to an actual module, that takes me about 10 months.
Okay.
Because to get it into production, it's a different thing, because the moment when it's production, it needs to be a totally reliable thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do a lot of testing. And basically, one of the nice things is that I do my own things. I don't take a schematic from the internet or something from somebody else and sort of copy it. I really design the stuff totally myself.
Right.
But that means that you also design the sound.
Yeah.
And so I spend a lot of time sort of looking for the right sound, and until I have found that sound, and I built several prototypes, and all prototypes give exactly the same sounds. So meaning that when you go put it in production, it's repeatable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that takes time.
Sure. Well, and it's interesting though to hear that this kind of design methodology that you follow, it really is, you really hold yourself to that very, very seriously, don't you?
No, I have to make my own life interesting for myself.
I hear that. I hear that. Well, Rob, I want to thank you so much for spending the time. It was great to get to hear about, your perspectives and how you approach this stuff. I mean, it really aligns with my sense of what the musical result is. So that's really fabulous. Thank you so much, and I really do appreciate it.
Okay, pleasure is all mine. Thank you very much.
All right, bye now.
Bye.
Okay, many thanks to Rob for that chat. A lot of fun. Really interesting stuff. Remember again to please take a look at our Kickstarter campaign. We're trying to get an update on our mic and mic pre. So if you could do that, you can either check the show notes or you can run over to Kickstarter and just do a search on art, music, technology. You'll find us. It's pretty straightforward. Beyond that, I want to thank you, the listeners, for showing up every week, for continuing to give us some great numbers on our end, and for just in general supporting me. I appreciate it so much, and I'll talk to you again next week. Bye.